I'm oral historian Mike Chappell. Today, June 4th, 2011, I'm interviewing Dr. Jesse Roth for the Endocrine Society at its annual meeting being held this year at the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center. Dr. Roth, as you look back over your career, what are the things that you consider to be the most important aspects?
The thing that I feel is most important, and I think that we're known for, are receptors. And it's hard to imagine now that somebody had to discover receptors, but we really did. And in the olden days, nowadays, if you say, I discovered a new hormone, the first question that a graduate student turns is, well, what's the receptor? So given that hormone receptor is such a pair, it's hard to imagine that a long time, not so long ago, there were no receptors. And you say with me, well, what were they thinking? And so they used to think that the hormones went right into the cell. If you put a cell or tissue in with hormone, some enzymes would get turned on or turned off. And so they assumed that hormones like vitamins, they would go into the cell, they would find the enzymes, and then the combination of the hormone with the enzyme would do what it's supposed to do. So we were kind of lucky. We were a little unhappy with that. And so my buddy and I, IRA Pastan and I, it was 1963. We had just gotten to the NIH. And our boss there, we had both been doing some nice work and on other things. And my boss said to me, Jesse, you could keep doing that. That's a good way to go. But, this is a special time, special place. Why don't you think of the best thing you could possibly work on? And so that's when we started to work on the receptors. And the question we were asking is, well, let's say insulin gets to a muscle cell. And the muscle cell starts to take up glucose. How does the muscle cell know that insulin is there? The muscle is being bathed with 10 million different molecules, and only one of them is insulin. How does it know the insulin is there? And that was what got us to say, well, there must be something there that's really recognizing insulin from everything else. And we thought, well, that must be going to be the receptor. Now, initially, we thought it might be inside the cell, but in fact, we started to play around with it, and it's clear that it was out on the cell surface. And that was a surprise to everybody. Everybody had assumed that the hormones just went right in. And once we were able to convince ourselves, first, when you do research, the first thing you have to do is convince yourself that you're right. And then you have to figure out how you can convince the world that you're right. So by about... we started in 1963. By 1965 and 1966, we knew we were right, but it took us another 3 or 4 years to get the system to work well so that we could prove to the world. We were also very lucky that once we did, they accepted it. So by 1969, 1970, we could actually label hormones with radioactivity. We could get preparations of receptors from cells. We could put the two of them together and show that they really were receptors. And what we did at first with ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, on adrenal cells. But we did that one because we again, were guessing that this was a simpler system to work with. In those days, you could hardly ever get any pure hormones, and that's why you had to pick systems where you could get them. Nowadays, every hormone, you get as much as you want if you have a little bit of money. In those days, they were hard to find. So you could get insulin. That was available. And ACTH was one of the others. And that was also, they didn't know the structures of a lot of the hormones. So we were lucky. We took ACTH because you could buy a lot of it relatively cheap. And you could, if you put a radioactive iodine onto the molecule, you knew exactly where it was going to go. And you knew how to purify it. And so we knew a lot about ACTH. And then we picked the adrenal because most hormones, once you broke the cells, you didn't know what happened. But Sutherland, a few years before, had discovered that a lot of the hormones, when you put them in with cells, would activate adenylate cyclase. So with the adrenal, you could break the cell, get cell membranes that still had adenylate cyclase. So when you put in ACTH, it would turn on the adenylate cyclase. You knew there had to be the receptor there. And it was that combination that allowed us to really do the first one. Once we did that one, then the rest were a cakewalk. We did the insulin receptor almost immediately after that. And our neighbors next door, upstairs, all got excited. They did their own pet hormones. And so within a few years, everybody was doing receptors to hormones using basically the concepts and the techniques that we showed for ACTH and then insulin.
Now, when you say cell surface receptors, how do they work?
Okay. Now, the cell surface receptors are they're proteins. They're manufactured in the cell, and then they're brought to the cell surface. And they sit there waiting to having a recognition site that sits out there. And then when the hormone binds to the receptor, some activity in the receptor is activated. In the case of adenylate cyclase, some of them have adenylate cyclase attached to them, so when the hormone binds to the receptor, the adenylate cyclase turns on. That's what happened with the ACTH receptor. In the case of the insulin receptor, there are tyrosine kinases. These are proteins that phosphorylate other proteins on tyrosine. So when insulin binds to that receptor, the tyrosine kinase gets turned on. Now, that wasn't known for another 10 years after that, but at least we could show that the binding of insulin to the insulin receptor fulfilled all the expectations you had of how an insulin should work, and we had that.
What were the scientific ramifications of all this?
It turned out they were much more than we ever dreamed they would be. First of all, there were diseases that we could find that were associated with disorders in the receptors. We found that, for example, some patients who could hardly respond to insulin at all. You have to give them massive doses of insulin to control their sugars. And it turned out that one group of them had a congenital defect. They were born with insulin receptors that were imperfect. There was another group of them that had antibodies against the receptor. And antibodies were binding to the receptor and interfering with the binding of the insulin. So these were patients. We got 6 patients, very quick time. 3 of them with antibodies, 3 of them with congenital defects. And in the clinics where they'd worked, the doctors were just mystified. Why are they unable to respond to insulin? And we were able to show. And once we did that, other people found a lot of disorders of receptors. And nowadays, if you discover a receptor, there's no reason you won't expect to find a receptor that's overactive or underactive or any diseases associated with it. The other thing that we found that was, again, retrospectively not a surprise, but in prospectively a surprise, the receptors are regulated to an enormous amount. Everybody knows that hormones go up and go down as the biological system needs it, but a hormone will go up 10-fold, 20-fold, but the receptors can go up and down 100-fold, 1,000-fold in number and make all the difference in how the system works. We were just, I remember what happened, even in my own lab, it was tough convincing the guys that we were right. And we did many more experiments than we ordinarily had to do because we could convince ourselves early, but we had to convince if we couldn't convince our buddies, how are we going to convince the world? So that was a very big surprise again, that regulators were so highly receptive. The affinity of the receptor changes, but much more so the number of receptors can be 1,000-fold, 10,000-fold up and down. It makes all the difference in how the system works.
What about, excuse me, go ahead.
One of the other surprises that, again, caught us off guard, and I can even remember the minute God, you know what that means? Everybody assumed that the hormone binds to the receptor by this time. That was and then the hormone receptor together would turn on whatever turned it on. But it turns out that's not the case. The hormone binds to the receptor, and the receptor is activated and doesn't need the hormone anymore. So it's really the receptor that has the full activity of what we call. So when I say this hormone has that action, it doesn't. The action the hormone has is to turn on the receptor. It's the receptor that has the action. And so
that's still not presented that way.
It's still not presented that way, but if you ask people, they really all know that. Mm-hmm. I remember when we first published it. Insulin and its receptor, is the receptor more important than the hormone? And I started to get hate mail from the endocrinologists because they thought I was trying to undermine the whole endocrine society because I'm downgrading the hormones. But what it really means actually, though, is that you could actually turn on that receptor with things other than the hormone because the receptor is big. And there's a lot of room on it. So, for example, there are antibodies that bind to the receptor and turn on the receptor without the hormone being there. In fact, shortly after we did our early pioneer work on the receptor, the guys who were working on hyperthyroidism realized that was the answer to a very long-standing problem. One of the most common forms of hyperthyroidism is called Graves' disease. In Graves' disease, the thyroid gland is big and overactive and pours out a lot of thyroxine, and the patients are hyperthyroid from too much thyroid hormone. It turns out there are antibodies against the receptor for TSH. So it's not too much TSH that's driving the thyroid. In fact, the TSH levels are very low. So the normal stimulator is out of the picture. It's these antibodies binding to the receptor, and then the receptor has all the information, gets turned on, and is driving the overactivity. And so that came along just a few years after we did our work, and kind of extended the idea that really the activity is in the receptor, not in the hormone.
Now that aspect is, your receptor work. What other aspect of your career means a lot to you when you look back on it?
One of the things that came out of the receptor work that was nice is we became a hot lab. So we got the very best of young people from around the world coming to work with us. And so we had an opportunity to mentor a very large number of good young people starting out early in their careers. It was a hot topic. And each of them took a piece of it and developed it, and then went on to become very successful on their own. And so there were guys all over the United States, all over North America, all over Europe, all over the Far East, who came out of this cooking pot, this chowder that was cooking on our stove, and then went off to do great things. And now every place I go, there's a guy getting an award tomorrow, Derek Leroy. He came... a guy got a big medal here a few years ago. So all the young people that came to work with us then have grown up and become top guys. And I must confess that at my age and stage, some of the papers that we did we were very proud of before, we still are, but I think we're even more proud of the people that have gone on to become outstanding people on their own. In a sense, it's funny because as a teacher, you start out hoping that they'll learn whatever you're teaching them, and that maybe if you're lucky they'll become your equal. But in a sense, you don't really teach them specifics. You more teach them an exciting way to approach things, and they then take off on their own, and before you know it, you're learning more from them than you taught them, and pretty soon they're better than you are, and you're not hurt, insulted, if nothing, you're just proud and thrilled that, so when you get up to see them do it, you say, wow. So I would say that one of the great joys in this field is that it's such a friendly field, so mentorially committed, and then to watch your offspring, or there's another guy who's got an award who is the offspring of one of my offspring, so they're grandchildren, effectively, intellectual grandchildren, intellectual great-grandchildren, and this tree that we're all very pleased with and like each other and get along well.
Could I ask you a little bit about your family background, and maybe starting with your grandparents?
Sure, grandparents. Let's see. My four grandparents were born in Europe, Eastern Europe. They came to the States like millions of others to start a new life. Just after World War I. They were energetic and hardworking. None of them went to college. Not my grandparents, not my parents. My dad was unlucky. His father died when he was 12. He was the oldest, so he went out to work at age 12 to support the family. And in those days, the social net was very unpredictable. He was lucky there was greater family who helped out as it went along, but he basically was a family supporter from age 12 to age, 80, whatever it is. I was very lucky that my parents are born with optimism. They got married in 1932 at the very bottom of the Great Depression. My sister was born 13 months later. They only had one kid. They had me 16 months later, so they were optimistic people. And that was one of the nice things, that everywhere we, business and things went up and down, but we were kind of buffered from it, so we didn't feel the ups and downs. They were very supportive of us going to school. My father actually had even greater difficulty than most because the family was Orthodox Jewish and wouldn't work on Saturday. In those days, everybody worked 6 days a week. So to get a job that, he said he'd get a new job every Monday and he'd lose the job the following Monday because he wouldn't show up on Saturday. Finally found an industry which was, they were wholesalers that sold to mom and pop stores. The mom and pop stores were open on Saturday, closed on Sunday, and that would be their big day, was to sell the mom and pop stores on Sunday. So he actually, that was an industry he could be Sabbath observant. So he was amazing that he was able to keep the family together, and my parents really liked each other. I have an older sister, a younger brother. We like each other, so we were very lucky. All the things that are destructive of families and stuff, we were cushioned from. We didn't have to call the weather bureau to find out whose mood was where. Everybody, stayed around home. It was a very nurturing and very positive environment.
What kind of education did you have?
My opening education was actually a very good one. I went to a Jewish day school, and the days and these were pioneers. So we spent all morning from 8 to 12 doing Bible and Talmud and advanced studies, and then we do the English studies from 1 to 5. So we used to go to school 5, and actually almost 7 days. Part of that time I was going 7 days a week. And you get and I was having a good time. I wasn't feeling oppressed. The other guys felt the same way. And we were just having a good time. And then I went to a public high school from there. But we were lucky, both in elementary school and in high school, we had the gifts of the deprivations of the teachers. The women could almost do nothing else but teach or be librarians or things like that in those days. So we had very talented people as teachers. Also, the restrictions against Italians, Jews, kept them out of a lot of other jobs, so a lot of them became teachers. People who the next generation would become chairman of institutes and things like that. So these were a bunch of very devoted, very talented teachers. So I look back on all the teachers I had through grade school and high school, and they saw us as the future, and they really treated us, again, not quite, but almost like Pharaoh's children. I mean, they were very devoted teachers.
How did you choose to attend Columbia?
You really want to know the true story? I'll tell you.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. I was all set to go to the University of Pennsylvania. The Wharton School was a business school. And since all of our families were in business, I was thinking, well, maybe I should, But New York State in those days used to give out scholarships called New York State scholarships. And you sat for an exam, an all-day exam. If you got a good score on the exam, they gave you $1,400 a year towards tuition, which now seems like a pittance, but that was more than half of tuitions in those days. So, but you had to use it in a school in New York. So when that came through, I got an acceptance from Columbia and Cornell. Cornell was way upstate New York. My parents were afraid to send me so far away. So I wound up going to Columbia because there was a nice scholarship, and it was close to home. And but that was just fabulous for me. Columbia was really an eye-opener. It really was. Columbia, unlike a lot of schools, had very small classes, very intimate relations with the faculty, and so we learned literature and music and art and science, and we couldn't shovel it in fast enough. And I still look back on those days with, it was actually interesting. The public high school I went to was a very ordinary high school, and a large number of the kids were not going anywhere. And so we were very smart, my group that had really, so we were in high school, I got to Columbia and they were kicking sand in my face. The kids that had gone to private schools, the kids that had gone to Stuyvesant or Bronx Science, we were just nowhere near like those guys. So we really had, that first year was a struggle. But by the second year we were picking up speed, and by the fourth year we were really doing it. But that transition from being the smartest kids in the class to being the weakest was a shock.
What drew you to medicine?
Medicine was always fascinating to me, and I was actually lucky. Among my relatives, I had a couple of cousins who were younger than my mother, and they went into medicine, and they were very instrumental in warming me to how exciting it was. I even remember that one of the doctors, he had a full skeleton in his room when he was studying anatomy, and I remember as a 9 or 10-year-old going in there, just couldn't get over, the skull and the bones and the excitement of it. We always did science. Science was very exciting those days, and I remember having scientific experiments going on even as a kid in the basement. We were always putting dry ice into water, or we were putting in baking soda with vinegar and making minor explosions, and the kinds of things that kids would do. But the fascination with science in those days was total. So I think between the fascination of science, the influence of relatives who were physicians and liked it, was the stimulus.
And how about Albert Einstein College of Medicine? How did you end up there?
That's a good question. I was very lucky. And that's the other thing I didn't say, but I'll say later, is my life has been very, very, very lucky. And even things that looked like they weren't so good turned out to be very lucky. My grades were good, but not outstanding. And in those days, the prejudices in the medical schools against Jews, Italians, African Americans, women, very, very strong. And if you wanted to go into medicine, you had to be very, very good. My pre-med advisor at Columbia was very good to me and really helped me a lot. But I didn't get into any of the great medical schools. I got into, I don't want to call them second-line schools, but schools that nobody would. So I had a handful of acceptances, but none of the schools were out of this world. They were good, reputable, nearby. But so Albert Einstein was just starting to begin, and my cousin, one of the physicians, was very excited about this school because he saw all the great faculty they were recruiting. And he was the one that convinced me this is such a spectacular faculty. Go. Had I had a really hotshot school in my hand as an acceptance, I probably wouldn't have gone. But given that the other schools were, what the hell? And so we really took a chance. My parents encouraged me also to take the risk, and it turned out to be a very important break because the faculty was very young, exciting, and they devoted such attention to us, and they so stimulated us. We did all kinds of experiments with them, all kinds of things that never would have happened anymore and I'm sure it doesn't even happen at Einstein anymore because now it's a regular school. For a brand new school, it was just one of those extraordinary experiences. And it's funny too, Hofstra, the medical center I'm at now, is now partnered with Hofstra opening up a new medical school. And I was telling them, I said, I had such a fabulous time. I talked to another guy who was in the first class of another medical school. He had that same experience. A third guy, so a guy from University of Texas Southwestern, outstanding place now, he was there in the first day. This guy, the medical college in Hershey, same thing, he was there first. Being in the first class of a medical school has its, it makes you nervous, and it's not so neat. Things are a little bit not exactly tucked in, but the enthusiasm and the energy of the faculty and of the students, the esprit, is just covers all the little shortcomings. I've remained very close friends with these people I graduated over 50 years ago. It was like being a buddy in wartime, it's a kinship. Same with the faculty.
After you finished up at Albert Einstein, how did you plan out or envision your career unfolding?
We were lucky. In those days, research had a very high profile, highly respected by everybody. And so to go into research or think of doing research wasn't such a big barrier. Nowadays, the students tend to shy away from research, and there's only a small number that then catch the bug. For us, there were many more small research opportunities, but the general sense of research in medicine in those days was a very high priority and very much revered. Academic medicine was the same way. The sense of going into academic medicine was a career that people favored. I think the young people feel much less attracted to it than, for whatever reasons, it's not important. But so I wasn't. If I went to go into academic medicine, go into research, I wasn't an exception. I was, but we were also very lucky then that from Einstein we got excellent guidance. So when I was trying to pick an internship and a residency, they sat us down and asked us which ones where we would go, how we would help us find the proper places to go. They used their influence and connections to try and match us to the right places. So we felt like we were placed. We weren't just applying. and I got into a fabulous, one of the best ones in the country at Washington University, Barnes. My roommate wanted to go to Yale. He went to the Yale one. And so we were, so again, a new faculty, they felt their fulfillment had to be in getting us placed in all the good places, and they did it.
Now, you said you went to Barnes.
Yeah.
How come you went to Barnes? Was that?
Again, I wouldn't have known to go there, but in fact, in those days, it was probably one of the 4 or 5 best places in the country. You know, you can't imagine, in the old days, there was no medicine west of, I don't mean no medicine, but the outstanding academic medicine stopped at the Mississippi. The California schools were kind of regional schools. University of Washington was just getting started. San Diego didn't exist. Denver didn't exist. So it really was... so this place, I picked it because when I went to visit, it was clearly... can you imagine, it was an internship class of 10 people. The faculty were outstanding. It was a great break. They had fabulous endocrinologists there. First of all, there was a Nobel laureate pair there called Carl Corey and Gertie Corey. And they attracted fabulous people. And so Dave Kipnis was one of the young endocrinologists. He had just come out of Corey's lab. Bill Dowday. These people are outstanding endocrinologists in the annals of endocrinology, and they were among the faculty. And in those days, when you were taking care of patients, the consultants would come around every day, and it wasn't a big army of consultants, it was a small group. So you met all these people all the time.
Is that why you went there, for those people?
No, I realized that they had excellent endocrinology, but in fact, that helped, in fact, establish endocrinology in my ethos. Because it was such a strong teaching program. And you saw these people all the time. Lillian Recant was another endocrinologist there, a guy by the name of Reese. So he was the departments were all small in those days, and yet they had 4, actually there's another one I saw there, Franz Alexander, 5 first-rate endocrinologists in a department was unthinkable in those days, and had a big impact on me.
You were just getting into endocrinology then. What was the big picture in terms of hormone action at that time?
In those days, the idea was absolutely that hormones got into cells, would find any number of enzymes inside the cell to pair with, and then they would basically just help the enzyme to do what the enzyme was destined to do. It was a way to switch on the enzymes. And that was the whole... and in fact, if you went to an endocrine meeting, in fact, I went back and looked at it in the library, at the Salwin Library, and get out some of the old programs. You could find those papers. When I went to my first endocrine meeting in the early 60s, enzymes, hormones turning on enzymes was the major theme that went through the meeting. And so hormone action was really in its infancy in those days.
Now, when you were learning that, were you thinking about... Were you questioning that?
No, we weren't thinking that then. Then we were just, in fact, in those days you couldn't measure any of the hormones. You could measure an approximation of thyroid hormone, a less good approximation of steroid hormone, and none of the other hormones you could measure. So you had to make a diagnosis of too much or too little, or were you giving the right amount just on the basis of clinical medicine. It was a guess. And that was where my next mentors came along, Burst and Yallow. They were the ones who invented radioimmunoassay. It was the major method for measuring hormones. That was so I was an intern in 59 to 61. They did their grand paper in 1960, and I went there in 61.
Now, how did you get there?
By good luck. I had bad luck, good luck. I mentioned before that my roommate from medical school went to Yale as an intern. He stayed on in endocrinology at Yale. There was one other slot open, and they tentatively said, okay, Jesse, you could come, but we're not going to be sure until we see if the other guys who are here might want to go. The last minute, a Yale guy wanted to stay, and they called me up and said, Jesse, we're terribly sorry, we can't take you. So here was November, I need a job in July, and they just bumped me. My professor of medicine from Einstein happened to come to St. Louis to give a talk at Barnes. And he says, where are you going next year, Jesse? I don't know. Well, it's a little late. So he said, meet me at the Chase Hotel after the talk. And I met at the Chase Hotel, and that was the fancy hotel in St. Louis. It was like, the Waldorf. And in fact, it's so funny how naive and young we were. He ordered a drink, and he signed the bill. I never saw anybody sign the check. And I told him I was interested in endocrinology and what endocrine, thyroid, okay. And I knew. And
thyroid, did you say?
Thyroid. I was very interested in thyroid. In medical school, I had done a project on thyroid and did a couple of things on thyroid. So, and there was a guy in the Bronx named Burson and worked with Yellow. They were doing thyroid work. And I knew their thyroid papers. So he says, you know, I know Burson. I'll give him He says, write to Burson, tell him you want to come. So I wrote to Burson saying I'd like to come. And he wrote me back quickly a letter. Well, I'm not sure. He gave me all kinds of excuses, clearly hesitating. And then a couple of days later, before I had a chance to answer all these long questions that he asked me, I just got a letter from Dr. London. He says that I should take you. You're on. So again, I was sent by person to person. I didn't. And it was just at that time they were leaving the thyroid field, going into diabetes. They had just developed a radioimmunoassay for insulin, and all the thyroid work which they had done, which was very well respected but not revolutionary, was shifted aside. So I matched with them because of the thyroid, but we never really did any of the thyroid work.
Could you say a little bit about their stature, a little bit in the kind of the ethos of
Sure.
birth personality?
It was clear to the cognoscenti that 1960 paper was going to ignite the whole field, the whole world, and it did. So they were the first ones to measure insulin in blood at the levels it really was. When we came to the lab, they helped us and we helped them. We did growth hormone, and somebody else did. Suddenly, every hormone could be measured. But it turned out that a lot of biology is hormone-like, where cells are talking to each other using messengers like hormones, and those could be measured. So pretty soon, almost every messenger by which one cell talked to another could be measured using this technique for radioimmunoassay. It even worked for viruses, so hepatitis B virus could be picked up that way. When AIDS came out, it could be picked up. So it was just totally revolutionary. Within a couple of years, the people who knew what was going on said these guys are headed for a Nobel Prize. And nobody disputed that.
Did you know that before you went
there?
No.
When I went there, they were unknowns. They were miracle people in the sense they worked at the Veterans Hospital in the Bronx, which was not any mainstream place. They didn't train in excellent laboratories. So most of us who trained, we've come through first-rate laboratories who taught us and tutored us and so on. They were really almost self-taught. They taught themselves research. And they worked in a place that was a good hospital, but not a research center. And they had no connections. But by dint of their brilliance, really quickly made those kind of connections, were recognized. And then Burson died unexpectedly, age 54, in 1972. And in fact, Sutherland got a Nobel Prize for the cyclic AMP work in 71. And you almost wish there were two empty chairs on that Nobel. They should have been in that one. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't to be. And in fact, they gave it to Sutherland then because Sutherland was sick. He was known to be ill and, not going to be. But Burson was young and not known to be. So he died. And in those days, if a member of a team died, they often pushed them aside and they didn't give him the Nobel. And so, in fact, she was very grief-stricken because this lifelong research partner of hers dies suddenly. And in addition, she probably was harboring her Nobel dreams, and they were shattered maybe forever. Gene Strauss, who was a fellow in the lab, really helped her recoup her self. They did a whole burst of new things from the radioimmunoassay on hormones from the GI tract and the brain, and that convinced the Nobel Committee and gave her the prize in 1977. And it was interesting, too, because you mentioned Guillermin and Shalley, who got the prize. They suffered the same problem because a guy named Jeffrey Harris was the dominant leader of the hypothalamic idea. When I was growing up, the pituitary was the master gland, didn't take orders from anybody. Just then it became clear that the pituitary gland was not the master gland, that the lower part of the brain, the hypothalamus, was actually controlling the pituitary. And that was work where Jeffrey Harris was the dominant man, and Guillermin and Shalley were the brilliant biochemists who actually isolated these hypothalamic hormones. So that was a perfect threesome for them, and Jeffrey Harris went ahead and died the year before, and they again, but the wisdom was that Karolinska took these two groups, Razialo and Guillermin and Shalley, both of them who in the old school might not have gotten it, but in fact broke that dumb barrier that you could give it to the remaining members of the team. And so it was an exciting Nobel Prize. It was exciting to be in Stockholm with Roz. Yala was part of the party. And with Guillermin and Shally, it was really a splendid time for endocrinology.
Now, what did you do when you were what were you working on with Burson and Yala?
I was again very lucky when I got to work there. They in those days, until that time, they took very few fellows into that lab. And I was lucky. The same way they did a favor to Dr. London to take me, they did a favor to Dr. Goldner. And took one of his fellows, a guy by the name of, in those days he was Seymour Glick. He has since emigrated to Israel. His name is Shimon Glick. But he came there also as a fellow. And they said to us, you know, they meaning Yala and Burson said to us, you know, we have been very successful, much more successful as partners than we could have been as two individuals. So we encourage you to try and form a partnership.
That explicit.
Yeah. And we were also lucky because they were just suddenly becoming big shots, and the Yala family and the Burson family decided to go to Europe for the summer. So they told me to take off July, and I was, by then I was an intern, but I was broke. So I couldn't even go on vacation, so I got a job as a doctor in a camp. So I had a vacation in the Berkshires paid for. But what allowed me to do is I read every one of their papers before that. So by the time I came to the lab, I really had read everything. Meanwhile, Glick was working there. And when I came there, he was working on one. Burson Yala left us with two problems. One was to develop a radioimmunoassay for growth hormone, and the other one was to learn how insulin makes glucose go into cells. He started on the growth hormone problem, and I thought I'd start. I said, no. He said, do a partnership. Let's both work on the immunoassay for growth hormone. And that turned out to be very lucky, because that problem we solved in 2 years. The insulin glucose problem didn't get solved for 20 years. So, now we struggled. We had a lot of help from them. They treated us literally like Pharaoh's children. We were tutored day and night. We were given all the help you can imagine. They worked at the bench themselves and were very busy as well. And we didn't even have to elbow them, and they elbow us because, you know, to get your experiments done. I remember one morning we came in at 5:30 in the morning to get started. And they were planning to come in at 6:30, and they came in, and the whole place was filled with our stuff. And it was the gentle anger of parents, who ate the turkey. But it was that kind of a lab, and they were totally devoted to our success. We were very lucky that the thing worked out. It then turned out there was a whole physiology of growth hormone that was not known at all in those days, and we stumbled into it. So it was thought that growth hormone would just change as people grew from puberty or adolescent growth spurts. But it turned out growth hormone was a very dynamic metabolic hormone, and we stumbled. 90% of what's known now about growth hormone, we learned in about 4 months in the spring of 1963. And we were also lucky in a way. They had hit the parathyroid assay at that time, which was again another blank that needed filling in, exciting. So they were distracted. We had a chance to develop it pretty much without, being micromanaged. The other thing that happened, we then presented at a meeting. The big meetings in those days used to be in Atlantic City in April or early May. And we had the prime spot. Friday morning was the best spot to be on. Friday morning, 10 o'clock. My friend Glick presented the paper, brought the house down. And so we were stars, young stars overnight. And Burson and Yao, again, were very good to us because whenever he said, "Oh, Saul, that's great work." No, the boys did that. And it wasn't in a demeaning way. It was in a, oh, no, they. So they shunted all the credit to us. Now, it turned out that the growth hormone assay helped validate the general concept of radioimmunoassay because they were in the insulin field, and the insulin field was mired in conflicts about the bioassays. And so even though the insulin assay came out, there was still intellectual civil war going on. But the growth hormone assay, the glucagon assay that Roger Unger did, the vitamin B12 that Sheldon Rothberg did in their lab, these were undisputed, so it validated the immunoassay away from the civil war that was raging on the insulin side. But we also became stars, really, literally overnight. And those papers became citation classics. And again, we were lucky that I didn't take the glucose transport problem.
Now,
I'm glad I got kicked out of Yale. Let me go back to the spring of 1963. So suddenly here are these two kids, me and Shimon Glick, and we're stars. So again, what happened was in those days the draft, America was at war. In those days they had a doctor draft, and we were ever since the age of 18, I was trying to stay out of the Army, and how I managed to dodge it, I don't know, because they told you to sign up this, do that, and I didn't do any of the things that the other guys were doing, and I kept not getting drafted. So the first year of my research, the advice was to go to NIH. If you got a job at NIH or Walter Reed or someplace, that would serve instead of having to go to Vietnam or wherever you were going to be sent. I went down to get a job at the NIH, and I got very good advice from one of the guys. He says, Jesse, I know you want to stay out of the draft, and they're going to offer you a job, but it's not going to be a good job, and don't take a not good job here. Only take a good job. And so, in fact, I turned down a job, and I spent a year in terror that I was going to get drafted. But that turned out to be a lucky break, because it was that second year when the work all came together. It then turned out also that the job I had wanted and didn't get the year before was a good colleague from the thyroid field, previously at Berson's. And Berson called him up and said, Ed, and he told us about the exciting work. And so, again, I got a job because I got sent from Berson to Ed Roll. And when I came to NIH, I was already a young hotshot, I just wasn't. Again, Ed Roll became a mentor. And
Ed Roll, it was
Ed
his
Roll,
lab?
R-E-L-L. And he was, again, a prominent member of the Endocrine Society. And he was the guy, when I came, he said, what do you do? I said, we'll do the growth hormone, we'll run the... He said, that's a great idea, it's okay, but this is a special time, special place. And that's when we started the receptor work. We were also, though, lucky that even though we got excited about the receptor work, we didn't drop the other work. So my advice to the young guys is, you have a great, great idea, do it about a third of your time. Because you got to pay for the lunch today, you got to pay the rent this month, so you need to do research that is bringing home results that you can present and go to meetings with. So in fact, I continued to do radioimmunoassay work all during those early years at the NIH while we were doing the receptor work. Because the receptor work, when we presented that early receptor work, nobody listened. It was just, but we were doing radioimmunoassay work. We did vasopressin, we did gonadotrophins, and that really kept the shop open. So Roll was right, take on doing something new, but I think we're also lucky that both IRA Pastan, my partner, and I myself continued to do other stuff that was productive. And that's my wisdom to the young people. Make sure you got your lunch and rent money covered, even if it's a great idea. The other thing that happens is that even if the idea works out, the scientific public may not be ready for it. So you could really bring it home and have no audience. So you really need the other stuff to keep you alive. And I've seen it where kids get very good ideas, drop everything, bring it home, and they starve out of the field because the timing was off.
What was Ed Roll like as a teacher, personality, scientist?
He was very smart, very encouraging. You never went to his... He was very nice in the sense you could always see him immediately. If you gave him a call, hey, can I come by and show you? Within a day, you got to see him. He always kept up with your work. If you sent him the paper to correct, he would get it back the next day, and it would have a couple of always good points. You never went to him not getting some good thoughts. Money was tight, space was tight like everywhere else, but you never went away feeling you were shortchanged. You felt uplifted, you felt rewarded, even if you got nothing. So he had the best way to send you away empty-handed but full-hearted. It's a very good style for a leader, for a parent, that you have very few pennies to give out and don't make the success of the meeting depending on spending those few pennies.
What about Ira Pastan? What was his scientific background, and how did you come to team up with him?
He and I have remained, again, good colleagues. We're still in touch. Shimon Glick also. These guys are all, lifelong buddies. Pastan came from a relatively modest background in the Boston area, went to Tufts Medical School, came under the sway of Ted Astwood, a leading endocrinologist, and Ted, when I first came as a young fledgling researcher to the meetings, Ted Astor was one of the elites, and he came over to talk about my work. And I was in fact, the Astwood lecturer was sitting at my table last night at the awards dinner, and I had to tell him who Astwood was. But Astwood really influenced IRA Pastan in terms of research, and he started on thyroid research because that was what Astwood worked on. And Gerald Auerbach is another namesake, is another award. One of my descendants is getting the Auerbach Award, and again, it was another Astwood devotee. So the familyness of this thing is very real, and again, handpicked, sent, nurtured, tutored. And Pastan came to the NIH earlier than I did. He then went and worked in an outstanding lab there, and it was just coming back to the endocrine group at NIH, to Rawls' group, as I was coming in. And so it was, and again, Roland encouraged us, think big, guys, get it. And so it was then we sat down, and it was really in July 1963, we posed the question, how does insulin know that, how does the cell know insulin is there? How does the thyroid cell know that TSH is there? And he working on the thyroid, me working on insulin, were limping along together, creating the concepts and creating the tools.
So you mentioned earlier that the dominant model of hormone action was the enzymes.
Yeah.
And then right now you just said, you started saying, how does it know it was there? What got you onto that question?
It's interesting. We were very lucky. We actually went around and looked at all the modest attempts.
Excuse me. People were happy with the enzyme.
People were happy. Yeah. And they're happy with the adenylate cyclase was now capturing the idea, well, maybe that was the intermediate before it got to the other enzyme. So everybody thought by then that when adenylate cyclase, cyclic AMP was discovered, that answered the whole question. We were convinced that cyclic AMP was being made inside the cell. How did the hormone get there? Couldn't get across. How could so many hormones turn on adenylate cyclase and have any specificity? And insulin didn't turn on cyclic AMP, and so we were dissatisfied. So we were, just in looking at the data, we just weren't happy that it made sense. And then we were lucky in that we went back and looked at all the other experiments that were done previously, thinking about and attempting to do it, and just went through those experiments, clear, where did they go wrong, what mistakes they made. So we actually went ahead and found some old experiments that were trying to get at measuring how insulin would bind. And then, in fact, Burson was actually a major critic of those experiments. So we just took those experiments and looked at them more carefully and redid them with much more sophistication, much more precision. We were also lucky. Burson and Yalow, in a run-up to their insulin assay, studied very carefully how antibodies against insulin bind insulin. And their introduction into the radioimmunoassay was through naturally occurring antibodies that patients with diabetes who got insulin developed. And they quantitatively studied that interaction in a very serious way, much more sophisticated way than anybody else did. And we said, well, why can't we, just like they recreated in a test tube how the antibody sees insulin, why can't we recreate how the cell sees insulin? So we really were, they were giving us a good idea of how to go about it without knowing it. And that was a good break for us, because that model, that was really our goal, recreating in a test tube what the cell was seeing.
And what hormone materials and target tissues did you
We started with insulin on muscle and TSH on thyroid. And it turned out that those tissues were just, the hormones and the tissues were not, they were good. We could get our experiments done. We could develop the concept. We could dip the hormone, we could dip the tissue into a bath of hormone, wash it away, and then show that the hormone effect continued. But that left the question, was it continuing because it started something that doesn't need the hormone anymore, or did the hormone need to be there? So the advantage we did then was, we then took the tissue and dipped it into antibody or into a destructive enzyme to destroy the hormone, and we showed that, in fact, you got rid of the persistent effect, meaning that the hormone was still there right on the cell surface. We were also lucky that we worked at low temperatures. Everybody who had done this before had worked at 37 degrees, because that was the physiological temperature. But by dropping the temperature, we could get the key first reaction in our hands without getting the second step or the third step interfering with it. And so we were able to actually figure out that they were binding, each hormone was binding to a moderate number, a fixed number of receptors. Those receptors were on the cell surface, and we could get at them.
And which hormone was this?
Insulin on muscle and TSH on thyroid were the first two that we did.
You were doing both at the same time?
Yeah. He was interested in thyroid, I was interested in. And it was good because we did one way, one the other, and they supported each other. So each experiment worked, but the two together was so supportive, really made it much more convincing to us and to our coterie of people that believed us.
And then you switched, though.
We switched to ACTH and to the adrenal because we could buy ACTH in fair amounts. The structure was known. We figured out where we were going to put the radioactive iodine tags and still keep the biological activity. It was known what the structure-function relationship of ACTH was. You could chop here, not there. You could fool here, not there. So ACTH was a molecule that was well mapped. Insulin was more complicated. They hadn't really mapped out insulin anywhere near as well. We couldn't iodinate it as cleverly. You couldn't, and the other thing was, you could break the adrenal cell and still have hormone action activating adenylate cyclase. You broke the muscle cell, insulin action was gone. TSH, you couldn't get a pure TSH in those days. So we took the system where the idea could be best worked out based on the idea we thought all the others would work the same. Now it's interesting that at that time, there was another thing I didn't mention. People really thought that each hormone had its own way to work. In other words, if there were 20 hormones, each hormone was going to have just like each vitamin had its own way, each hormone had its own way. We were already thinking that the rules were going to be simple. And so switching from TSH to insulin to ACTH didn't bother us. We were overconfident that that wasn't going to be a barrier.
Let's see. Now, then you did your paper on ACTH?
We did. The first paper on ACTH was 1969, 1970, a preliminary and an actual. And then we came bang, 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 3 more on ACTH, different aspects of it. We were able to, by taking calcium out of the system, we could really show binding without any activation of adenylate cyclase, showing they were separate. We could do a radioreceptor assay showing we could use the receptor to measure hormone. We did a couple of other, but anyway, we were able to not just measure it, but really do a few things with it.
Now, was that your first breakthrough paper of 70 or?
Okay, yeah, the first receptor paper we published, which was a moderately primitive system, was 1966.
And that was the insulin?
And that was the TSH, TSH and insulin with a relatively crude system. It was well received by a small number of cognoscenti. It got published in an absolute Class A journal, but it didn't have big impact. It was hard to grow it from there, but it was the basis that we then worked to do. And the 69-70 was the culmination of the technique. And then we did the insulin, followed within less than a year. We were already working on, while we were finishing up the ACTH, we now made an elegant insulin system. And we then made other systems, other people made other systems. So that ACTH 1970 was the wellspring for all the cell surface receptors, for ourselves and for our neighbors and everybody else.
And what happened to your career and your career goals at that point?
We were very lucky. The receptor stuff became fabulous. We started to close down any of the immunoassay stuff and other stuff because the receptors were just pouring good things. And diseases were showing up and regulation was showing up, all kinds of ancillary issues. Other people were doing work, so we were getting invited to meetings everywhere to talk about receptors. And at that time, the receptor, as it sprung up in a new field, saw the kinship with the other receptors, and so we were meeting people in 10, 12 other fields who want to know about receptors. Now the fields tend to be in silos again. You know, the insulin guys work with insulin. But in those days, there was a great fluidity, like the Renaissance. The boundaries didn't hold. The ideas spread.
Would you talk a little bit about rising through the ranks of the NIH and what made it so attractive to you that you stayed there for?
one of
nearly
the
3
one of the
decades.
most important things was Ed Roll. Ed Roll was a spectacularly good mentor. He stayed in his job, and I tease him, as long as you stay in your job, man, you got to give your boss a month's notice. You got to give me a half-year notice. So I was a senior investigator, which is the first rank of full-time permanent, and then I became a section chief very early, and then they made me a diabetes branch very early, and I had wonderful colleagues. Phil Gordon was recruited to help do some of the clinical work. Ron Kahn is now the head of the Joslin, came there. So we had a substantial sized group. We liked each other, a very egalitarian group, the ideas just flowed, and the space was tight, which was very good in a way because you saw we worked in a very large building, and you saw everybody. And it was really, the Bauhaus in Germany in 1919 to 1933, artists and designers came from all over the world. Doors were wide open, ideas were everywhere. That was NIH in those days. And because, unlike universities or hospitals, the departments didn't have a service function that made them separate units. In other words, they didn't have a biochemistry department or a physiology department. They were just kind of organizational. It's not like in a hospital where you had to have something. So there was this fluidity of structure and fluidity of ideas that was terrific. You also didn't have to ask anybody to do it. I used to joke about it. If your grandmother came to you in a dream at night, you could do the experiment the next morning. The equipment was there, the funding was there. You could just do it. I even joked, if you were really ambitious, you could go in that night and just do the experiment. Science was simpler in those days, too. You could do world-class science with much less training and much less background.
Now, so it must have been hard then, a decision when you finally left to go to
It was
Johns
a hard
Hopkins?
decision to leave, and a couple of things came to the decision. One was I was just getting to my mid-50s, which is around the age when I was getting good offers all the time, but then somewhere around the mid-50s, they stopped giving as many good offers. So the decision I was going to move, this was a good time to move. My kids were thinking going ahead to college. If I moved, I could take my pension, whereas if I didn't move, I couldn't. But even more so, it was, I went to one of my former bosses, and I saw that his books were lying exactly on the bookshelf in exactly the same place from 10 years ago. And so I said, oh, maybe I should move. Maybe I'm getting that way, too. So a bunch of things collaborated to do it, and it was fun.
And what were your responsibilities? What areas were you going to work in Johns Hopkins?
Johns Hopkins, I took over, the endocrine job was open and the geriatrics job was open. The geriatrics job was much a richer job and a bunch of very good people, so I took the geriatrics job. And I started to do endocrinology and aging and saw the connections there, and that worked out to be very good. So diabetes was really growing and getting the spotlight, obesity. Also, it's recognized that endocrine disorders in aging are different than they are in younger people who have been neglected. So all in all, it was, but also got excellent people, so we still do a lot of tutoring, a lot of mentoring. And in fact, one of the guys that came to me as a rookie in Baltimore my first year at Hopkins, he was just installed in a professorship, and we went down there for the dinner in his honor, and he was the third incumbent of the professorial chair that I had occupied when I first came to Hopkins.
What chair is that?
It was the Lublin, L-U-B-L-I-N, it was Lublin Professorship, a family of an alumnus of, a physician alumnus of Hopkins endowed the chair. Mm-hmm. And his family was there. And
let's see. What was the significance of the move in terms of your amount of time you could put in research and funding?
It wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad change for me. It was very invigorating intellectually because it was an area that I didn't know well. There were about 22 docs in the group, very smart, very nice. Geriatricians among the nicest doctors you ever want to. They're even a little nicer than the pediatricians even, who were very nice. And very smart. There were branches of the National Institute of Aging on the other side of the campus that we collaborated with. So we still had a lot of research going on, and but more time teaching, a broader range of teachers. But again, a vigorous program of mentoring and research.
How did you come to be at the North Shore Long Island Jewish Health System?
Yeah.
Again,
I had good luck and my bad luck.
This was 2000 now.
Yeah. I'd spent almost now 8 or 10 years at Hopkins. I was getting to be, so there was an excellent lab, small research lab up in New York called the Pickhour Institute. And a very distinguished guy and a friend of mine, Tony Cerami, was the founding director. And his wife and then ex-wife was also a friend of mine, and she was there. And I met some of the other young people, the 2 very good geriatrics fellows that had jobs there that I had met through the geriatrics community. And Cerami left and went to set up his own place elsewhere. And the Pickhour Institute had a search committee, and they recruited me. And it looked like a perfect job for me in the sense that what they wanted me to do is to head up this institute and do the kinds of things I did at NIH, and even more so. I was there, and I worked hard. I thought I did an excellent job. At the end of the year, they decided they didn't want me to continue. So I had a 5-year contract, and I was still on leave from Hopkins, so I was going to go back to Hopkins. But good luck had it. Pickhour was fighting with the North Shore Long Island Jewish Hospital System. The Pickhour was housed in research space at the North Shore Hospital. So I got to know the North Shore people because I was trying to keep peace between the Pickhour bosses and the North Shore bosses. And they got to like me. And I would never have known these guys, they never would have known me. But then when Pickhour bosses and I parted ways, that night I got a call from the North Shore guy. He says, you know, Jesse, I know you're supposed to go back to Baltimore. How do you want to staying here? And so, in fact, they turned around and gave me an offer. And so I became the geriatrician at the North Shore Health System, and then became a member of their research institute. After a year of Pickhour without me, Pickhour decided they didn't want the institute anymore. So they decided to pack in the institute, and the people were scattered. But the North Shore was trying to build up research programs, so the Pickhour Institute actually was largely taken over by North Shore. So a lot of the people I had met in my year at Pickhour moved over to North Shore and with me. So in fact, we had about 85% Pickhour alumni now as part of North Shore, and Pickhour left. And it was much easier because the North Shore guys were much easier to live with than the Pickhour guys. The Pickhour guys were very smart and very nice, but they were really micromanaging the program in a way that was done better by North Shore. Kind of left us to our own. And they built. One of the guys who left Pickhour also is now the the CEO and the president of this research institute. They've doubled the size of the space, brought in a lot of excellent young people, and now it's established in a medical school. This is now the heart of the medical school's basic science program. The medical school is very proud of it, and they've now set up a graduate school that had been a Pickhour graduate school, is now stayed on as at the North Shore, the Almezi Graduate School. They attract very good young physicians to get PhD degrees. I'm on the faculty, I meet with them, work with them. So my bad luck of not completing my term with Pickhour was a stroke of good luck, just like not getting the job at Yale was not getting the job at NIH. I was lucky when I was unlucky.
Now, what are you working on research now?
So obesity and diabetes is just becoming the hottest topic in endocrinology and all of medicine. It causes devastation, all kinds of diseases. And we're learning that obesity affects all the organs of the body. Diabetes, we used to think affected the eye, the nerves, the kidney. But now it affects every cell of the body. We used to think it starts when the sugar got high, and we now know it even starts before the sugar is very high. So they're really very serious illnesses, very widespread. North America, all over the world, it's just the fastest growing disorder. Let me go back to Bersaniel in the early days. One of the discoveries they had when they measured insulin was they found that type 1 diabetics didn't have enough insulin. They showed that. But patients with type 2 diabetes had plenty of insulin. If anything, had more than enough insulin. And it was clear that the patients were not responding to the insulin. And in fact, they were insulin resistant. And so that idea was a theme developing in the 1960s. Well, that theme really came to full fruition probably in the late 80s with the concept of the metabolic syndrome. And the metabolic syndrome is a concatenation of several things, but one of the key features is insulin resistance. So the metabolic syndrome has insulin resistance in there as the cornerstone, and then high blood pressure and abnormal lipids and other things that come with it. And we think that the metabolic syndrome is being turned on by the obesity, and it's the metabolic syndrome is driving a lot of the damage all over the body. And if we could regulate, we think that exercise turns off the metabolic syndrome, dieting turns off the metabolic syndrome. So here's the struggle of the body turning on and turning off the metabolic syndrome. And we've been working very much on it, trying to analyze its features, its components, and coming up with aspects of it. We developed mice that made too much insulin, and we could show that these mice, just by making too much insulin, could develop the features of the metabolic syndrome. And so we think that actually it may be, at some early point, the insulin level goes up, and that then drives the rest of the metabolic syndrome. And that's one of the things that we're working on now. And that brings together a lot of the old work that I'd been exposed to in Burson Yalo's lab, work we did at NIH with the receptors. One of the earliest mechanisms of how insulin resistance develops was showing that high insulin levels knock the insulin receptor levels down. It knocks down the post-receptor activation. So we actually, early on in the insulin resistance field, could show each of the pieces that were associated. And our colleagues, our younger colleagues, again, developed more of that. So there's been a continuity of this idea of insulin resistance starting really 1960 through the receptors, through metabolic syndrome, and now the disease states that are really reaping the whirlwind because of the epidemic of obesity and diabetes.
How could you weave the Endocrine Society into that story a little bit?
I think it's funny because in those Burson and Yalo were both very active members of the Endocrine Society. The second presentation, and one that really brought it together, the growth hormone, back in 1963, was a symposium here at the, we were paraded at the, Burson presented the work and paraded us as the STARS Network. Year after year, we would come back and present our work at this meeting. I was on the council of the Endocrine Society. So we've been, all this work that I've done has been richly rooted in the Endocrine Society. We come to the meetings every year. We participated in the workshops. And so I would say this is really clearly one of our major homes here at the Endocrine Society.
Are you looking forward to anything in particular at this year's meeting?
This has been an exciting meeting. First of all, to be interviewed for you will be a history. Going to the awards dinner, I've been to the awards dinner on multiple occasions. I have 3 awards from the Endocrine Society, the junior, the middle, and the senior awards. So I've been to those award dinners before. I have nominated colleagues and friends who've worked with me who've gotten, so many of my youngster colleagues have now gone on to get major awards from the Endocrine Society. And I was there last night. One of my colleagues now just got the Auerbach lectureship. And as I said, one of the mentees of a mentee got an award. So no, we've really been part of it. We did that last night. He's going to give a major address tomorrow, and I'll be there to cheer him on. And we're very much at home here, and the kinships are. One of the great things about endocrinology is it's a very friendly field. The people like each other, and even when we're competing, it's a friendly competition. It's a sportsmanlike competition. We have great, and I think the mentoring is one of the things that's done it, is that most of us, Burson Yalo came on, they sprang from Zeus's head. Most of us were mentored and tutored, and I just had unselfish, devoted, talented tutors. And I hope that, I think I've inculcated that in the people who worked in my group, and they continue. It's a pleasure for me to go to their groups and see them mentoring their young people in that same kind of enthusiastic, unselfish commitment to their success.
I'd like to ask you about your current views of the field in terms of, well, just your own general views, but also maybe you could mention something about the complexity and the levels of complexity that you've encountered since you first started with the simpler theories to what you're...
The complexity is daunting in a couple of ways. It's hard for people to, it's easy to get into a silo. That is a limited area where you just talk to each other about the complexities of your system, and the generalizations seem to get lost. And also, I think the fields stimulate each other a little bit less because they don't. In the olden days, we could go to meetings and understand all the papers and talk to each other. The complexities have made it a little more of a Babel where the languages don't cross easily. It's also hard for the young people. In my day, smart, hard, young, working guys could be doing world-level science in 2 years. It's hard to do that now. The apprenticeship is longer. The same thing that's happened also is that the medical school has gotten more complicated. They don't have as much research, training, or time because the teaching has been more intensive. The debts that the young doctors accumulate pushes them to go into higher paying areas. In my day, we just did what we wanted to do. Somehow there was just not enough money to manage everything. So it's a much tougher time. But we had the draft. That was, again, the kids can't imagine those. The other nice thing to see, though, is that the prejudicial barriers in medicine have largely disappeared. Even for the women had it worst of all, worse than the other minorities, because at least for the men, at least their families and friends were on that team, even if the medical schools were against the Italians and the Jews and the African Americans. But with the women, even their families were against them. Go become a secretary, go to work and help your brother go to medical school, or his wife, they would. So it's nice to see now that in fact the women are given full opportunities, and foreigners, it's a pleasure to see so many people from abroad getting full opportunities, and it's a very impressive change that's happened in 50 years. 50 years has made all the difference. The rainbow that you see at the endocrine meeting, and the number of outstanding women. Yala was a pioneer, almost unique when she was doing her work. And she had all those barriers. They wouldn't take her to graduate schools. You couldn't get jobs. Family didn't want, So it's amazing now to see the total change. And young people can't imagine it was that way. No. It's funny. I remember the guy who I went to. There was a guy next to me in college. He was a pre-med. He was African American, track star. Everybody knew he was going to either go to Meharry or to Howard because African Americans only went there. Mm-hmm. I used to attend down at Howard when I was at the NIH. And you talk to the attendings at Howard, and they couldn't take graduate work, and they had to go to, it was just amazing. Now, again, you go to medical schools or hospitals, and again, women, African Americans, Jews, Italians, foreigners. We've had a rebirth of freedom in America.
Thank you.